Going live. I'll just begin. Tēnā koutou. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along tonight. I'm Georgia. I'm the chair of the Wellington branch of the Antarctic Society of New Zealand, and I'll be moderating the session tonight. Thank you all for joining us in our second talk in the webinar series, A Place for Peace and Science by John Rogers. We'll hear shortly from Linda Kessel, the president of the Antarctic Society, who will introduce John, the speaker. But I wanted to go through some logistics first. While there are no H&S evacuation plans that I need to run through, there are a few things to note. First, if you came along to our first talk in our series, Isolation by Jamie Stutz, which is now available on our YouTube channel, you may notice a few things that we've done differently this time. Namely, we have a YouTube channel, which you should all be watching on right now. This is where you'll find, as long as we're able, any recordings of talks from national and branch events. We are using YouTube to give you a user-friendly and secure, high-quality interface on which to view these webinars and other videos that we will provide. While YouTube is widely accessible, to comment and ask questions on these live videos, you must sign in and subscribe to the channel. That stops any anonymous and possible nasty comments coming through. And for whatever reason, to sign into YouTube, this requires a Gmail account. So we apologize for any inconvenience. However, we think that the positives overall outweigh the negatives. Please also remember that we're still live streaming and are new to this, and we're using our personal internet connection, so we can't guarantee a seamless production. However, we're trying our best to produce you all entertainment through this time. So we need your patience. And on that note, John the speaker has quite a slow internet connection, so we've actually pre-recorded his presentation, and then we'll be coming back live for Q&A. So please ask questions at any point, and I'll be collating those and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. So thank you again for coming tonight, and I'll hand over to Linda, the president, now to welcome you again. Thanks.
Hi, and good evening to you all. This is becoming a bit of a habit. It's great new habit. And I think that what I'd like to say, which is what I said at the first one as well, for those of you who came along and perhaps didn't as well, is that this is a sort of new direction for us, and certainly one that we're really keen on in terms of it being able to encourage all the membership to be part of this rather than just branch by branch. And so, as we probably know, in the past, some branches have had far more events available to their membership than others, and so this is the real positive that I see. And there's been a huge amount of work put in by Georgia, by Stefan, by Nicholas and the comms team. And I can only say thank you so much for taking many of us from being dinosaurs into the 21st century and beyond. But I'd like to encourage anyone who's listening, has got people that they'd like to encourage to join the Antarctic Society, to do that and to go to that antarcticsociety.org.nz and join up. It is a little bit strange at times when you try and log in. It sounds like you're trying to shop for something. So just to bring you up to speed here, $75 per person, and there also are group fees available in terms of your subscription. If you do get stuck, just maybe get hold of your committee group, whether that's Georgia and Christoph in Wellington, or Shirley and John in Christchurch or Canterbury, and Robin or Ken at the Auckland branch, and I'm sure that they'd be prepared to help you to make sure that your friends and so on can join up. If they do, as mentioned before, there's the double issue that was distributed in February of the magazine, and with it goes the LINS map, the Antarctic map, the first in 25 years. So it's really important that if you would like to sign up or sign somebody else up, that they will actually get that double issue of the magazine and the map, and be party to a lot of these webinars and perhaps a few other things as well that you get as being a member. So I'm hoping John is somewhere nearby now. I'd like to introduce him. He is the co-chair of the Canterbury branch of the Antarctic Society and a very long-standing member of the New Zealand Antarctic Society. And his topic, I understand to be about the Antarctic Treaty, 1959, from a personal perspective. So welcome, John. I'm really looking forward to this, as I'm sure the rest of the membership are as well. So off you go.
Okay, I'm going to hope that I have just been introduced. I feel a little bit like the news reporter who they switch to live, and all the news reporter does is introduce their pre-recorded story. So my pre-recorded story will come next. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope I'll be able to join you for Q&A afterwards.
Thanks, John.
Hello, team. My name is John Rogers, and I'm presenting this talk about the Antarctic Treaty System on behalf of the New Zealand Antarctic Society. So the Society is a group of people with an interest in the Antarctic, quite committed to being active and social on all things related to the great southern land. So I encourage you to check out our website and think about joining in. This particular talk covers the Antarctic Treaty System, and it was originally created by my friend and colleague Hannah Nielsen. Now, she was kind enough to give it to me, and I've adapted it, and I'm the one speaking to you now. I'm John Rogers. And I should say that it is strictly my own. All the opinions that I am going to express in this talk are mine and mine only, not the Society's. And that it's being delivered in April 2020. So I'm here in lockdown just outside of Christchurch. Hopefully in the future, this might be a distant memory, yesterday's nightmare for all of you listeners. But the treaty system is a changeable structure, so I think we should note that this talk was given at this time. Let's get going. So here we have a fellow eating an ice cream cone at the South Pole. What a lucky guy. It looks a very tasty treat. And I think we all would love to change places with him right now. Although right now in April it would be awfully cold and dark at the South Pole. But what's this got to do with the Antarctic Treaty System? Why is this fellow eating the ice cream important? And what about that flag and that base in the background? What's that all about? Well, that's what we're going to discuss, so here we go. But first, let's have a quick look back at what happened before the treaty. The early exploration of Antarctica was driven by a desire to discover and to claim the unknown parts of the Earth. The early explorers, Cook, an Englishman, Bellinghausen, Russian, D'Urville from France, and Wilkes from the USA, were all looking to plant the flag of their country on the new land that they discovered. And the next group to come along were the ones looking to exploit that new land. So these were primarily the sealers, but later the whalers as well. The Belgica expedition from Belgium was the first to overwinter south of the Antarctic Circle, and the first hut built on the Antarctic continent still stands at Cape Adare, and that was built by Karsten Borchgrevink's Norwegian/British expedition. The raising of flags reached its high point in the heroic age. This was the last burst of imperial expansionist mentality of the early 20th century, claiming the last blank space on the map. In addition to those claims, there were strategic concerns about the control of the sea lanes and placement of weapons, especially between England and Germany, and there were economic concerns, resource exploitation, looking for minerals, oil, and coal. 1912 was an especially important year, with Britain, Norway, Germany, Japan, and Australia all sending expeditions to Antarctica. And of course, the Norwegian and the British flags were raised at the South Pole in 1912. Expeditionary efforts died down as World War I intervened and the pole had been reached. The most active efforts came from the USA, mostly due to the heavy influence of Admiral Richard Byrd. Byrd was the first to fly to the South Pole in 1929, and his 1934 expedition was sponsored by Grape Nuts cereal. It sent live radio dispatches home and was accompanied by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. So Byrd could see the value in Antarctica. He could see it and tried to convince others in the U.S. of that value, especially from a strategic perspective. By the end of World War II, various nations had laid claims to parts of the continent, and the map looked like this. The Norwegian claim was based on Amundsen's explorations, and New Zealand had inherited the British claim on the Pacific side based on Scott. But Britain also claimed sovereignty on the Atlantic side based on the explorations of James Clark Ross. Australia and France claimed their own areas surveyed by Douglas Mawson and Dumont d'Urville. Argentina and Chile based their claims on the proximity to South America and the geological link with the Andes continuing onto the peninsula. And note there was this unclaimed section. This section of Antarctica is very difficult to establish any occupation even today, and no one wanted it, or at least no one wanted it enough to try to establish a claim. Tensions were rising. The Germans had actually made territorial incursions during World War II. There was overlapping territory, and some nations were missing out. Things could easily have gotten out of hand and led to great conflict, but something extraordinary happened. Science is what intervened. So, okay, it wasn't a superhero in a yellow jumpsuit, but the next best thing, namely unprecedented international cooperation over a scientific event known as the International Geophysical Year, or IGY. Now, we're going to talk about the IGY, but I should make an aside here, noting that back in the 50s, when the IGY was going on, science was male-dominated, and we have a male figure here. But in today's world of science and in today's world of Antarctica, women scientists play a major part and are a truly valued part, an equal part of the teams. The IGY was actually the International Geophysical Year and a half, lasting from July 1st, 1957 until December 31st, 1958. And it was truly an international effort. Almost 30,000 scientists from 66 nations took part around the globe. 12 countries worked in Antarctica, including all of those that had claimed territorial rights. The number of stations in Antarctica rose from 20 to 48, more than doubling. Wintering population increased from 179 to 912, more than quadrupling, and the summer population swelled to almost 5,000. Throughout that year and a half, there were many scientific advances, including the areas listed, most of which included at least some effort in Antarctica as well. But most importantly, it was deeply politically inspiring. Free exchange of information was part of the deal, and exchange of scientists was encouraged. So this fostered cordial relations between political enemies as the team of scientists worked together. The IGY also generated massive public interest and awareness. It ended a period of isolation following World War II. Now, the Cold War was far from over. In fact, it was kind of at its height. But the outstanding successes of the IGY led the Antarctic claimant nations to agree that peaceful scientific cooperation in the Antarctic should continue indefinitely. Another factor bringing Antarctica into public focus was the first successful crossing of the continent. This British Commonwealth effort was very well covered in the popular press. It included Sir Edmund Hillary leading the support party. Now, Sir Ed is as well known in New Zealand for driving his farm tractor to the South Pole as he is for reaching the top of Mount Everest. So with this positive environment, the negotiation of an agreement, the Antarctic Treaty, commenced immediately after the IGY. The treaty essentially designated Antarctica as a reserve for peace and science. Still, the treaty was not inevitable. In fact, it wasn't even the first choice. There had been various calls in the United Nations to internationalize Antarctica and to sort of make it a kind of a world park, but none of these had been able to succeed, mostly due to dissent and vetoes from the claimant nations. Once it was decided, the work on the treaty proceeded very quickly. On December the 1st in 1959, there were 12 original signatories, and it was incredibly good timing. The success of the 1959 Washington Conference was facilitated by what Valery Kuznetsov, the Soviet delegate, described as favorable conditions, most notably by the fact that the cooperative framework of the IGY had put the whole thing in place, but also the fact that relations between the East and West had improved slightly by recent progress on the Geneva nuclear weapons talks, and by the visit made in September of 1959 to the USA to address the United Nations by Nikita Khrushchev, the then Soviet leader. In retrospect, it's certainly fortunate that the treaty was concluded at this time, because only 5 months later, there was serious disruption when the Soviet shot down the U-2 spy plane from the US, and then later the international crises centered on the Berlin and the Cuban Missile Crisis of the early 60s. So it's very, very likely if the treaty had not found this sweet spot in late 1959, it would never have been completed at all. Okay, so that's how we got there. But what is the Antarctic Treaty itself? Now, as international treaties go, it's very simple. It has just 14 articles. And there have been some extensions added in subsequent years, but the original articles all stand and are all still in effect today. So let's look at them. So Article 1 says that the Antarctic is to be reserved for peace and science. No military activity is to be conducted. And 2 further says that all that science has to be open, that you can't reserve your results, you have to cooperate and you have to share results. Not only do you have to share results, but Article 3 says that you have to share logistics. You have to be open and allow other people to work with you. Article 4 sort of became the official joke of the conference, which was that all those territorial claims were frozen. So no one relinquished the territorial claims, but they agreed not to pursue them and not to make any new claims. Article 5 said that it was to be nuclear free. Nuclear power is okay, but no nuclear testing or no disposal of nuclear wastes. And Article 6 covered what the area was, which was all of the land and the ice shelves south of 60 degrees south, but not the waters, not the surrounding waters. So this treaty only covers the land and the ice. Article 7 states that there's open access and that any area that's under the control of any signatory nation must be open for inspection by any other signatory nation. Article 8 says that everybody polices themselves. In other words, the jurisprudence for anyone in Antarctica is under the laws of their own country. Now that makes it a little tricky when people who are citizens of non-signatory countries come to Antarctica, but for all intents and purposes, each citizen is policed by their own laws. Article 9 says that consultative meetings have to take place among the member nations, and they do. They take place annually. Article 10 tries to discourage any bad behavior by anyone in Antarctica. Article 11 places the emphasis on consensus, and we'll talk about that a bit in future slides here, but all of the decisions made under the Antarctic Treaty System are made by consensus. And Articles 12, 13, and 14 really deal with kind of minutia and logistics about amending the treaty and who will join and so on and so forth. So there are two kinds of members or signatories of the treaty. There's so-called consultative and non-consultative members. Now, all of the signatories to the treaty, all of the nations that sign on, agree to be bound by the articles of the treaty, but only the consultative nations get to vote. Now, currently there are 54 signatory nations, of which 29 have voting rights. So you can see that very quickly here. There are only those states in red kind of around the equator, smaller developing nations that haven't signed up to the treaty. Almost all of the developed world has either signed and is consultative and has voting rights, or has signed and is an observer to the practice. Now, to become consultative, you must take significant part in research and activity in Antarctica. In practice, this means establishing a research base and being active in the community in the Antarctic. The most recent example of this is the Czech Republic, who gained voting rights in 2014, and the most recent non-voting member is Slovenia, who ratified the treaty in 2019. At the annual Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, all decisions are made by consensus. Now, consensus-based decision-making doesn't mean that everyone must agree. It means that no one can voice disagreement. So I talked earlier about consultative members of the treaty system having voting rights. It's really more like they have veto rights. And so if one country feels strongly about an issue, they can stop a resolution going forward. And this is actually true for many similar international bodies. So that sounds slow, and it can be slow, but on the plus side, the treaty has been in existence for several decades, and the parties seem committed to working within this framework to pass some significant resolutions. So as I said, even though it's consultative and consensus-based, there have been significant measures passed. And here are some of the most important ones. These are some of the major agreements that have been passed and added to the Antarctic Treaty System. So in 1964, there were agreed measures for the conservation of all Antarctic flora and fauna. That one has now been superseded by the Madrid Protocol. In 1972, there was a convention on seals, and that allows actually for hunting of seals with permitted activities, but currently no permits are issued. In 1980, the CAMLR, the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, was passed, and that covers the seas and not the land. It's really a name that only a bureaucrat could love, but it's extremely important in the framework of the Antarctic Treaty System. In 1988, the Convention on Regulation of Mineral Resource Activities was passed. It too was superseded by the Madrid Protocol. So the Madrid Protocol on Environmental Protection is the big piece of new protection for Antarctica that's been passed under the system. It was first proposed in 1991 and eventually ratified in 1998 and came into force. Now, it's interesting to note that there is no convention in the Antarctic Treaty System on whaling, and that's because the International Whaling Commission predated the treaty system. It goes back to the 1930s, and it had already taken control and management of the whaling in the southern oceans. The Kamilar Convention entered force on the 7th of April, 1982. So it's a while ago now. The impetus actually was in response to increased commercial krill fishing. The krill, of course, is the keystone species, the basis for the Antarctic food web, and real commercial exploitation of krill was starting to happen, and the claimant or the nations interested in the Southern Ocean could see that this needed to be controlled. So Kamilar does not stop harvesting of marine resources, but it controls it. It tries to ensure that any fishing in the Southern Ocean is done in a sustainable manner and takes into account the entire ecosystem. Now, Kamilar is kind of a parallel body to the Antarctic Treaty System. It has 36 member states, of which 25 have voting rights. And it also has a scientific committee that is constantly active and advises the Commission on measures that need to be taken for conservation. The area it covers is that area in the left in the green. It's about 10% of the world's ocean. And in particular, some of the achievements of Kamilar have been to address the challenge of illegal and unreported fishing. So fishing by ships that are not covered under the Kamilar system. It's worked very hard to reduce seabird mortality from fishing. It's also, as I mentioned, established that Kamilar ecosystem monitoring program, and it's increasingly creating protected areas, marine protected areas. And the most recent and the largest is the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, which came into effect on December 1st, 2017. Now, 72% of that marine protected area is completely no-take, so it's completely protected. The other part of it, the other 28%, allows some harvesting and some scientific research. Now, this is a really interesting story. I have a friend, a colleague who I worked with, and he was at the meeting in Hobart, the Kamilar meeting in Hobart, in which the Ross Marine Protected Area was created. And that area had been actively promoted by New Zealand and the USA for a long time, but actively resisted by other members of Kamilar. And just about a half an hour before this meeting in Hobart was supposed to break up, the Chinese representative came over and said, well, if we just make this little tweak here and we just change these boundaries a bit, I think we can all agree that this can be passed. And they all scrambled and they put together the motions, and in the very dying minutes of this meeting, they managed to pass this marine protected area. So like so many human activities, it's kind of down to the back room and the political influence and the deadline pressure that caused this to actually get instantiated, to get officially ratified. The Madrid Protocol on Environmental Protection was passed in 1991 and ratified in 1998. It designates Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science and sets forth the basic principles applicable to human activities in Antarctica. It protects all native flora and fauna. It prohibits all activities related to mineral resources except for scientific research. It mandates the elimination of waste, including the cleanup of waste from past activities, and it prohibits any discharge into the sea and establishes special protected areas. So it's a very comprehensive set of environmental regulations that have superseded any previous ones passed by the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. When it was ratified, a 50-year review period was agreed, and this is therefore set for 2048. It doesn't seem to me that there's much likelihood that anything will change, but who knows what the future holds. An immediate outgrowth of the IGY was the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, or SCAR. SCAR was founded in 1957 at an IGY meeting in Stockholm, so it actually predates the treaty. It currently has 22 full member states in the dark blue and 11 associate member states in the light blue. Now, SCAR itself says, quote, SCAR is charged with initiating, developing, and coordinating high-quality international scientific research in the Antarctic region, including the Southern Ocean, and on the role of the Antarctic region in the Earth system. In addition to carrying out its primary scientific role, SCAR also provides objective and independent scientific advice to the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings. SCAR meets every 2 years to conduct its administrative business, and it currently has over 30 research groups addressing various aspects of Antarctic research, divided into geoscience, life science, and physical science. Well, not directly part of the Antarctic Treaty System, the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, or IATO, plays a key part in life in Antarctica. And if you are so lucky to be able to visit the Antarctic Peninsula as a tourist, you will certainly go on an IATO member voyage. So when the Madrid Protocol was passed, the 7 current operators at that time banded together and they formed IATO. Today there are over 100 members, and the organization provides really valuable services to the tourist industry, including many of the briefing materials and guidelines that are used to set practices and policies by all the operators. Now, I've worked for IATO companies, and I know the value that IATO provides. The Staff Field Operations Manual, distributed by IATO to all expedition guides, covers every aspect of planning and managing visits in Antarctica. The electronic version of the field guide that I have on my laptop comprises 580 files and 2.4 gigabytes of information. So it's a really valuable resource and a really worthwhile effort by these tourist companies. So here we see the big picture. The Antarctic Treaty System is obviously a large and complex beast, but it also manages a hopeful and an inspiring story, the creation of an entire continent reserved only for peace and science. But of course, some questions do remain, and if something sounds too good to be true, we should be suspicious because it probably isn't true. And is that really all there is to the Antarctic Treaty System? Well, you may have guessed that the answer is no, and we should always be suspicious of simple narratives. It's a complex world, and so our explanations of it need to be complex as well. So I want to present just a little alternative picture of the way that science is used as a cover for the continuation of old-school, self-interested geopolitics. And naturally, there's been a long-standing relationship between science and politics. Scientists went along on most of the early Antarctic explorations, even if they were just there to raise the flag. And today, there's nothing that a politician, a prime minister, and a president would rather do than travel to their country's Antarctic base and be seen to be promoting and basking in that fame and that glory. This map of Antarctic bases is slightly out of date. It's hard to stay up to date because the picture is changing constantly. The most recent year-round base additions were by India in 2012 and South Korea in 2014. So why do these countries establish bases? Go back and remember what it requires to become a consultative member. you need to be able to show significant work and participation in the community in Antarctica, and that really means having a base. So it's difficult to see on this map really, but the claimant nations have covered their own claimed areas with their own bases as best as they were able. So thus the peninsula, because of its relatively ease of access, but also because of its overlapping claims, is very heavily populated with bases. And those bases are there to show that the claims may be frozen, but they're not entirely extinguished. So that's fine if you have a historic claim, but what if you're a non-claimant nation? And especially what if you're a big, powerful non-claimant nation like the USA, or like China, or like Russia, or the USSR? The answer is you build bases. You build big bases. You build many bases. You build remote bases. Thus, the USA has McMurdo, the biggest station in Antarctica, which is kind of a mini city with several thousand summer residents, and also the impressive South Pole Station with several hundred residents. USA has 5 stations in total. Russia has the remote Vostok Station and the large Bellinghausen Station in the South Shetland Islands. Russia has 7 active stations. China has the remote station Kunlun on Dome A in the interior, and the newer saucer-shaped Taishan Station also in the interior. China has 4 bases in total. Now, China is interesting. It's investing heavily in its Antarctic program, and it's explicitly stated that it's not particularly happy with the current order and is working to become a leader in Antarctic affairs. China sees the Antarctic Treaty System as an old rich man's club with collective hegemony and China being relegated to a second-class role, and they're working to counteract that. Many Chinese scientists and policymakers view tightened environmental controls, protected areas, and so on as a ruse to maintain the power of the established interests. Looking more closely at the operation of the treaty system, is it really as global as it first appears? And in fact, it's a pretty tight club. As I said, a nation can only get voting rights by doing significant scientific work, which excludes many poor and middle-income nations. And in fact, privately, British diplomats at the original meeting admitted that this was to exclude the, quote, troublemakers, such as the newly independent Third World states and the Soviet satellites. Thus, Malaysia and others can host meetings and try to lobby voting nations, but have no real power. And non-state organizations are invited to observe, but also have no say. So prior to the signing of the Madrid Protocol, Greenpeace went so far as to establish its own base and promote heavily their own world park ideas for Antarctica. The official narrative of the Antarctic Treaty System remains that scientific idealism has largely trumped political rivalry. And that is mostly the case, but the same old great power politics are still at work. Claimant nations are still unwilling to do anything to undermine their own claims, and non-claimant nations are unwilling to do anything to support those claims. All are thinking ahead to the time when the pie might be carved up. As I mentioned, one potential carve-up comes in 2048 when the environmental protection is due for review. And so what's going to happen at that point with resource exploitation? The map shows known mineral resources discovered during the IGY and in other exploration. Most or all would be difficult to exploit economically, but diamonds and oil are possible, and no doubt some companies might be willing to try. And there are other resources not covered by the treaty at all. Consider bioprospecting or looking for new properties in Antarctic flora, fauna, or microbial life that might have commercial value. For example, we have the proteins that allow the fish in the Southern Ocean to live in the freezing waters. Those proteins have been harvested and used to make ice cream more creamy. So maybe even the one that was being eaten by the fellow in the first slide. There's, in addition, the fact that much research is funded in the hope that results can be patented and commercialized. And who benefits from this form of exploitation? The treaty is completely silent on this, and so doesn't have all of the answers yet. So there's quite a lot to take in here, and that's because the Antarctic Treaty System is a complex beast. And it's one that constantly is evolving and responding to international and national shifts in values and priorities and political stances. The fact that decisions are made by consensus can help slow things down, but it also helps to make sure that nobody feels sidelined and that all the matters are well thought out and deliberated. So why does the Antarctic Treaty matter? And first of all, it protects a large area of the planet to be used for peaceful purposes only, no wars and no nukes. It gives primacy to scientific investigation, including free availability of observations and results from that scientific research. It puts territorial claims on hold. It provides for a system of cooperation among the nations of the world, and it provides robust environmental protection for the continent and 10% of the world's oceans. So all in all, definitely not a bad thing. The Antarctic Treaty thus sets aside the continent as a place for peace and science. But politics continues to be a major concern that underwrites really all of the activities in the Antarctic region. The Antarctic Treaty System has been incredibly successful in preserving the peace and promoting the science and protecting the environment, and this would surely be hard to maintain if the treaty system would be seriously challenged or to collapse. Now, I personally think that there's very little chance of that. I do look forward with hope and optimism. I think that we can. We need to understand that there is complexity. It's the beginning of the story and not the end, but I think that the future is bright. So here we are back at the beginning. We're looking at our peaceful, cooperative, environmentally aware scientist that we looked at the beginning of the talk. The ice cream still looks delicious, and it might even have those proteins from the ice fish, but hopefully you can now see that politics is always there lurking in the background. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that presentation. I've listed a few of the places that you can look for further information if you have any questions or want to follow up. And of course, I do again recommend that you visit the New Zealand Antarctic Society website to check out the list of upcoming events, to see what other Antarctic resources are available, and of course, to become part of the community of Antarcticans that is such a great group to be part of.
All right, audio is on, camera's on. Thanks, John. That was fascinating. I have long been completely obsessed with the treaty and how successful it has been. It just astounds me that it has managed to bring all of the nations together in a way that we haven't been able to achieve previously. I think we're relatively proud in New Zealand of our own treaty, albeit many issues. However, this is definitely, a step up, and it's something that's been long lasting in a more modern society where we choose to make this this choice to work together. Sorry, I'm just eyes flicking everywhere, waiting for John to come back on. Here we go.
I'm back.
All right, thanks, John. That was really great. And I hope everybody's visuals and audios worked really well. We'll just go straight into the Q&A. There's been a few questions. First up, we have from Craig Stevens. His question is, given that it is proving so difficult in the present day to get climate consensus among governments, what worked differently in terms of governments agreeing when the treaty was set up?
Yeah, great question. I wasn't there in 1959, I have to say, or I was there, but I wasn't paying a lot of attention. I think probably the economic interest that was held in Antarctica at that time doesn't compare to the economic cost of eliminating carbon from modern economies. I think also that there was a lot of negative, that's not quite the right word, there was a lot of pushback against the claimant nations because they weren't the big powers particularly, and they could see that their position was not sustainable. So I think that they saw the inevitable and gave in. And then, of course, there was the powerful lobbying by the scientists with their governments.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? We have another question from Maxwell Quinn, who says, hi, interesting presentation. The question is, it's been 30 years since the Madrid Protocol. What will happen in 20 years when it's up for renewal?
Yeah, 2048, that's what I understand at least. 2048 will be revised or reviewed. So I got my rose-colored glasses on here. I think that the community is pretty strongly committed to retaining those environmental protections. I don't see that there's enough economic pressure to be able to push things through. I personally expect a kind of a rubber stamp, but it is a ways away yet. Maybe there will be changes in the world. We know we're living in a fast changing world, but my expectation is for continued environmental protection of Antarctica and maybe even enhanced.
Yeah, I've always wondered, I think, I've spoken with a few people that have been down to Antarctica about what happens when the ice begins to melt and we have more access to land than we used to, and how that might affect people's kind of current perception that we don't really have the money or the resources to do anything in Antarctica apart from science. But if that ice began to retreat and we were able to more readily access some of those resources, then perhaps that might change governments' perspectives on whether they want to re-sign the treaty as it is.
It's possible. It's possible. I suspect they'll all be so busy in the Arctic at that point that the Antarctic will be taking the back seat, right? So.
That's a good point. We have another question from Jared Huntley. Thanks for the webinar. Do you think there will be any short or long-term effects on Antarctic policy and the treaty in response to the COVID and current economic crisis? Will the governments be forced to reduce funding? Quite likely.
I mean, governments around the world are spending huge amounts of money, and like it or not, Antarctic science is not at the top of their priority list. So I'm aware that there are big projects planned by a number of countries, rebuilds in McMurdo, rebuilds of Scott Base, development by China and Italy and others in Terra Nova Bay. I would not be at all surprised to see Antarctic research budgets cut significantly. But again, we live in a fast-changing world. I don't know, but I suspect that will happen.
Yeah, hopefully we're able to see beyond, this current immediate crisis and can look forward to something that's going to continually affect us. I think that as well, to your point around the treaty, is how we all share logistics together. That's a big point, is that it's not even necessarily New Zealand's choice and whether or not we could afford to go, but all of the nations kind of need to be able to afford to go together. Otherwise, we can't do those expeditions or programs alone. We have to work together on this. So it's very much waiting for the world to respond to us all.
Absolutely.
We have another question from Robin Kappa. We visited the Chilean station in November. Seemed more military stake in the ground than science. Their mission was search and rescue, but presume have to do some science too.
Yeah, I think that's right. I've been to a number of small bases on the peninsula where there's summertime only and there's a dozen or fewer people. They usually do a bit of meteorology. They usually do some base maintenance. I always say they're doing mostly political science, right? They're there just keeping the Chilean or the Argentine or the British flag waving in that disputed territory.
Yeah. And one last comment from Maureen. Any thoughts on the impact of climate change on research? Would think obviously now that the research is vital to understanding climate change, and do you think that that will increase the research funding?
Yes. I mean, if there is going to be research done, the climate change and the study of past climate history in the Antarctic will be at the very top of the list.
Oh yeah, I agree. Or that's maybe just optimism or self-preservation. Okay, John. Well, I think those are all of the questions. Oh, sorry, one last one. How accessible is current Antarctic international research to New Zealand scientists? From Robin.
So I'm not a New Zealand scientist, but I do spend some time with some of them. My understanding is very accessible. New Zealand is very active in SCAR. We hosted a SCAR conference here within the recent past. Many New Zealand scientists work on international collaborations for drilling or for sea ice research or for any discipline in Antarctica you care to name. So I think New Zealand is extremely well respected in the Antarctic community, and everybody would love to work with us.
Yeah, I agree. As an Antarctic New Zealand scientist, I would say that you know, as a small country and a small kind of research resources that we have, we rely upon collaborations with international groups, and you know, the same. A lot of other research institutes out there are in a similar position to New Zealand, and we all have to work together to kind of get anything done. And that's almost the beauty of Antarctica, is that cost is so high that we work together to ensure that we get the best results out, and that those results are benefiting everybody. It's not a kind of self-interest science working in Antarctica, is it?
Okay, I guess we're done, are we, Georgia?
Yes, we're done. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, John. Thank you, Linda. And thank you to everyone behind the scenes. That has been fantastic. And it seems like we haven't had any glitches. So thank you all for listening. And we will be in touch about the next webinar when we have that organized. All right.
Okay. Stay well, stay safe.
Yes, stay home.